Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to be here this morning and to introduce you to the forthcoming Women's Week. This is a very important meeting, symposium that has been arranged by Hilary and by Kate, and we should congratulate them for their initiative. I would like to use Chairman's privilege to pay a few acknowledgements of my own. First of all, to the nursing staff who really nurtured and cared for my faltering footsteps through my career in the medical wards of the Royal Infirmary over a period of 40 years. Kath Asher was a sister in Ward 6 when I was a senior house officer. Isabel McKinley, who was a staff nurse in Wards 2 and 3 and who later became the matron. And more recently, Margaret McKelvey and Sally Hughes ensured that my blunders were minor rather than major. I also was fortunate in having a splendid set of junior colleagues. I have followed their careers with great interest and with pride. And I would especially like to acknowledge Jackie Taylor, First Lady President of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons and still practicing medicine, and whose college lectures in these difficult times have been absolutely stimulating and compassionate and really an example of what a presidential letter should be. And then we have Hazel Scott, who is now currently chair in Liverpool, organising the medical curriculum there. Catherine Calderwood, who is Chief Medical Officer, and Catherine Stirling, who is looking after the problems in the Western Infirmary. It was always the Royal Infirmary's task to look after problems in the Western Infirmary. They came to us for consultants. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this programme that you will be hearing over the next week contains all sorts of good things, from the Dorcas Society to the matrons to young surgeons. And overall, I think we are in for a feast of knowledge, and I certainly expect to learn a great deal. My first task is to introduce Alistair Tough, who, as archivist to the Greater Glasgow Health Board, has made enormous contribution to the work of Friends of Glasgow Royal Infirmary. His support has been invaluable, and he is omniscient about the background and traditions of the Royal Infirmary. As I said before, this is a major contribution by Hilary and by Kate, and I think it will highlight to the community, not only the medical community, but the wider community, remind them of the major contribution that women have made to the work of the Royal Infirmary since its inception. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm going to be talking today about the development of nursing at the Royal Infirmary, more widely across Glasgow, and with some reference to developments further afield from the 1840s up to about the 1950s. Now, the first thing that I need to do, and this is a little bit awkward because I'm no great expert on the subject, is say something about work for women in the middle of the 19th century. On the slide, there's a photograph of a kitchen maid taken from a popular television drama, and alongside her, a genuine Victorian housemaid. And that, I think, just serves to illustrate the point that for a lot of women in employment, domestic service was the most common form of employment, but also quite a desirable one, especially if you worked in a large house with a big establishment where there would be some sort of career progression ladder. There are a variety of other forms of employment available for women. They tend to be areas of economic activity where good eye-hand coordination is important. And I've listed a few on the slide. And of course, there are some jobs for teachers as well, although that's quite a small scale in the 1840s. It's only with the introduction of universal primary education that the demand for female teachers begins to become much bigger. On the slide, the last employment group that I've listed are the women who make their living cutting fish, filleting fish, which in Glasgow would have been a fairly substantial number employed down at the fish market on the banks of the Clyde. The sort of social hierarchy that the Victorians observed is replicated on the slide. So the women who make their living as sex workers out of prostitution are at the bottom of the slide, and they are also at the bottom of this hierarchy of social respectability. And for nurses, that sort of hierarchy is significant because in the 1840s, the social standing of nurses is just a bit higher than that of prostitutes and probably more or less the same as that of fish workers. Significant change begins in the realm of psychiatry. Now, to the best of my knowledge, this is not a thing that Florence Nightingale liked to acknowledge, but I think it is significant. The slide shows the Glasgow Royal Lunatic Asylum, which stood on the site which is now occupied by the bus station, Buchanan Street bus station. The person who drew this would have been standing more or less where the Royal Concert Hall is now located, and the buildings which are visible at the back and left-hand side are the warehouses of the canal terminus at Spears Wharf. And this building is significant both because of what happened there whilst it was a psychiatric hospital, and also what happened there when it became the city poorhouse after the asylum had moved out to Gartnavel. So, change in nursing, I would say, really starts at the end of the 18th century with the influence of Dr. Tuke, no relative to me, I should say, at the retreat in York. His ideas, which he writes up at some length, involve what he calls moral management. So kindness, calmness, unselfishness on the part of the staff charged with caring for the mentally ill, something very different from what had gone before. His ideas take a time to spread, and they're adopted in Glasgow in the 1840s. So more or less at the time when the Glasgow Asylum is preparing to relocate away from Parliamentary Road out to Gartnavel, they are also beginning to try consciously to improve the calibre of the nursing staff. And one of the key things in this is that they require that all new appointees should be able to produce a character reference from a minister of religion. So they offer better terms and conditions of service, and in return they're looking for a better calibre of person. And in doing so, they're laying down a pattern which actually spreads elsewhere in the world of nursing. And a key part of that, and this is very influential for a long time, is a sort of high moral, ethical tone to thinking and writing about nursing work. Now, a lot of the nursing which is actually taking place around Glasgow in the 1840s, the 1850s, is being done by unpaid members of staff, in fact, by inmates in the poorhouses. The poorhouse system comes into being at a time when the Church of Scotland has split into two rival groups, so it's no longer possible for the church to administer social services, and they become the responsibility of civil parishes. In Glasgow, there are 4 civil parishes, all of them really quite large with very big populations. As women are admitted to poorhouses, they're classified. Some are classified as being respectable, others as dissolute. And although a lot has been said about discrimination against Irish people in Glasgow, it's interesting that when you look at the records of the poor law authorities, you find that a lot of the respectable women are actually Irish women. They're women who've come to Glasgow because their husbands have got jobs here, and then when the husband loses the job, he goes somewhere else in search of work, and they're left in a city where they have no mother, no sisters, no relatives, and they go to the poor authorities when they run out of cash. And the allocation of nursing duties is related absolutely to this classification of female inmates. Those who are seen as being dissolute and in some sense responsible for their own impoverishment are allocated the job of looking after patients with infectious diseases, and the respectable women are sent to the somewhat more pleasant and safer wards, mainly to look after children. One of the problems that arises is that the therapeutic regimes of the day place considerable emphasis on the use of alcoholic beverages. And of course, if you put the dissolute women in charge of the infectious disease ward during the hours of darkness and give them tonic wine to give to the patients, what happens, of course, is that they drink the tonic wine and start having a party. At the buildings which we saw on the slide just a moment ago, the Glasgow City Poorhouse, formerly Asylum, one of the resident medical officers is James Byrne Russell, who is a very famous figure in Glasgow's medical history. He's a young man. He lives in the City Poorhouse, and he's particularly concerned about this pattern that the inmates who've been sent to the infectious disease wards are rioting and at the very, very best, neglecting and possibly abusing their patients. So he makes a point of getting up. He sets his alarm for 3 o'clock in the morning, gets up, goes down, checks, and if he finds a party going on, then he makes sure that those responsible are all thrown out the next morning. Things move on, partly because of the huge challenge of infectious diseases. Not all people suffering from infectious disease are paupers. So you cannot simply rely on the poorhouse provision to look after people with infectious diseases. And from the 1860s onwards, there is a big development towards the construction and staffing of permanent fever hospitals. By this stage, James Byrne Russell has moved on. He's now the medical officer of health for Glasgow. He's very much involved in designing and staffing first the temporary hospital at Kennedy Street and then the much larger permanent hospital at Belvedere, in the London Road. And there's a quotation there on the screen from James Byrne Russell which indicates the sort of challenges that he faces. If you look at the register of nurses recruited to work at Belvedere starting in December 1870, look at the first 12 months of that, you can see that the problems that he's referring to are not imaginary, as a number of staff have to be sacked because they're detected stealing or found to be drunk on duty. I've mentioned the name of Florence Nightingale there because I think it's an open question to what extent her writing and her campaigning has an impact at Belvedere. I think it probably does have some impact, although there will be other factors at work. The fact that there is a decent nurses' home built alongside the wards, and that each of the nurses recruited has her own bedroom with a wash-hand basin is a real pull for people who come from very overcrowded accommodation, often having to share, at the very least, with their siblings. Having access to your own room, having tennis courts and bowling green and so on is a real pull. Now, clearly, nursing with unpaid, untrained people in the poor law section is unsatisfactory, and change eventually takes place. The building on the slide is Barn Hill Poorhouse, which in the 20th century had a shocking reputation, but in the 19th century had a very different standing. Now, there are a number of reasons why the poorhouses move over to having trained nursing staff, and I've listed 4 on the slide. The first 3 are probably fairly clear. The 4th one may come as a bit of a surprise to some folk, but accusations of improper behaviour against male medical officers could be absolutely devastating to their careers. I know of one instance of a relatively young man who went to be resident medical officer in the poor hospital in Govan, who was accused by a female patient of having touched her inappropriately. Now, there was an investigation, he was exonerated, but his fiancée broke off their engagement, his friends wouldn't speak to him, he was completely ostracized and had, in fact, to leave Glasgow and relocate, set up a medical practice in Australia in order to get over the consequences. So at Barnhill, which was on the previous slide, they started to train women as nurses, particularly so that they could lead a workforce of poorly trained or untrained inmate nurses. So basically, they're training them as nurses and also very much as supervisors. And so Barnhill, up in the north of Glasgow, where the Red Road flats stand today, becomes the main source of trained nursing staff for poor law institutions throughout Scotland and for much of the north of England as well. The poor authorities pay the Glasgow City Parish to train their staff. So let me finally get round to the Royal Infirmary. Now, of course, we're probably all aware of the importance of the impact of antiseptic surgery on the nurse workforce. The photograph on the slide is a famous one. It shows Sir William McEwen in his operating theatre, and the figure second from the right is Mrs. Rebecca Strong, who appears to be simply observing the proceeding. She doesn't seem to be taking any active role in it, but she's there. Now, of course, the breakthrough in antiseptic surgery is Joseph Lister's. That is his great breakthrough, and it does have an immediate impact on the standard of nursing care in the infirmary. Not in print, but privately, Lister blamed poor nursing for the failure of some of his early antiseptic post-operative care, that the nurses didn't really grasp the importance of washing their hands. They didn't see why it was necessary to keep cleaning around the post-operative wound, etc. So, the famous series of published cases starts with one that was wholly successful and is then followed by a succession of others, which are also wholly successful, but it omits a number which did not have a satisfactory outcome, one of which resulted in the amputation of a limb. So, of course, for Lister, raising the standard of nursing is, to a large extent, about routinizing high standards of hygiene. And he does have an impact, and there is change in the Royal Infirmary. From the mid-1860s, there is systemic change. The nurses begin to have decent pay, better accommodation, and some sort of sense of career progression if they stay in nursing. But I think the real big breakthrough in nursing in the Royal Infirmary is not Joseph Lister's, it is Rebecca Strong's. And, of course, she depends to some extent on Sir William McEwen as her great collaborator. McEwen is a mercurial and difficult character, but he's also a highly effective advocate. And the two of them together make quite an impact. Having said that, let me just dwell for a moment on the nature of the recruits coming in by the 1880s, the 1890s. And they are not what Florence Nightingale had anticipated, nor indeed are they what J.B. Russell had thought would be the characteristics of the new, improved nursing workforce. Both of them imagined that they would be recruiting women in their 40s who'd had children and reached the stage in life where their children no longer depended on them, and so they were available to care for other people. But in reality, the applicants for nurse training at the Royal Infirmary tended to be younger, unmarried, much better educated than Florence Nightingale had anticipated, and many of them were quite simply middle class. The preliminary training school, which I'll speak about in just a moment, charged 5 guineas for the training course. So that's a significant sum of money in the last couple of decades of the 19th century. So I think you can see why that might be a factor, but it's not the only factor. It's also about there being a significant number of young women who are not married, who are sitting at home. They've had comfortable homes, good diet, warm, dry accommodation. They're strong, they're fit, they're healthy, and they haven't got an awful lot to do. And they positively welcome employment that is physically demanding, that actually makes demands on them, gives them a sense of purpose in life. And all of this is possible because there is a nurse's home in which only women live. So Papa and Mama can see that their daughter is secure from unwelcome attention from men. She may have to put up with all sorts of foul behaviour in the wards, but at least in the nurse's home, she has some security. So the preliminary training school is the Royal Infirmary's great contribution to the development of nursing and nurse training. The introductory remarks leaflet, which is on the screen, is dated to 1893 when the PTS gets underway. So previously, the probationers, the trainee nurses, were expected to absorb knowledge, to learn on the job, to simply pick up things as they went along. And this is a pretty haphazard way of doing things. A good deal of their time was taken up with things like, attending to the fire, because all the wards had coal fires. Most of the year, the nurses had to keep the fire burning. Obviously, the probationers had to keep the fire burning. And they did an awful lot of pretty routine domestic work, collecting up teacups and porridge bowls and so forth. So that their development, their knowledge development, was pretty haphazard. Some of the senior medical men working in the Royal Infirmary were very enthused about nurse education, put a lot of thought, time, effort into teaching nurses. Others were much less concerned. So it was a bit patchwork quilt approach. The preliminary training school marks a terrific change because from that point onwards, you have the idea that those who will become nurses should first sit down in a formal educational environment, classroom environment, and do some basic learning. And then when they've grasped the rudiments of anatomy and physiology and pharmacy and hygiene and so on, then they go into practical classwork, but this is highly structured. This is not just a haphazard pick it up as you go. It is actually properly thought out as a syllabus of training. At the bottom of the slide, I have put a quotation, and that, I think, does link back to what I said about the moral management of the mentally ill. There is a strong emphasis on what are essentially Christian ethics in all of this. So here we have Mrs. Strong writing about the preliminary training school. This is not dated. It's from the 1890s, but precisely when it was published, we don't know. At least I don't know, so maybe somebody else does. On the screen, we can read the words, "Nursing can demand remuneration on an average with other livelihoods for women, and why the preliminary cost it entails for special instruction should be looked upon as a hardship any more than special instruction for other purposes, I do not know." And this is Rebecca Strong defending herself against the accusation that the 5 guinea fee excludes otherwise excellent candidates. Meanwhile, there is development going on in the world of the poorhouses, and a critical element in this is the identification of the tubercle bacillus by Professor Koch in Germany. Koch publishes his first paper on the subject in 1882. It takes a few years to be disseminated, but the implication that tuberculosis is in fact an infectious disease, although it does not resemble cholera or typhus or typhoid or whooping cough or scarlet fever. In other words, it's not a fever. Up until this point, the Victorians had thought that infectious diseases were characterized by fever, high temperature, a crisis, either the patient dies or they begin to recover. Tuberculosis isn't like that. But once it's realized that tuberculosis is a transmissible disease, then the voluntary hospitals, like the Royal Infirmary, the Western Infirmary, the Victoria Infirmary, become very, very reluctant to have TB patients in their wards in case they give the disease to other people. So the burden of caring for TB patients is thrown quite disproportionately onto the poor law hospitals. And whatever scheme they've had to employ inmates as unpaid nurses, albeit under the supervision of properly trained staff, breaks down under that pressure. The essence of this, I think, is quite easy for us to understand. You know, if you've watched the film Oliver or any of the adaptations of Charles Dickens' famous book Oliver Twist, you'll be familiar with the idea that urchins stole gentlemen's handkerchiefs. It was a highly portable, easily hidden object that those with light fingers liked to trade in. And one of the absolutely essential things that has got to be done in a TB ward is to burn handkerchiefs. People with TB cough and spit, and their infected blood goes into the fabric handkerchief, and the handkerchief got to go into the incinerator. Now, that is a thing which poor law inmates find very hard to do. They will hide them, and then they will pass them over the wall to friends who can sell them for a few pennies. And that spreads the disease. So they have got to have a much larger staff of properly trained nurses who understand that you have got to deal with sputum, you've got to be willing to incinerate bedding and pillows and so on. So you need a much larger complement of trained nurses. Key breakthrough in all of this is to do with funding. This may sound a bit dreary and techie, but it really is important. The UK Treasury starts to pay 2/3 of the salaries of the nursing staff. And so the financial burden on the managers of the poorhouse is comparatively modest, and they get into the business of building nurses' homes, producing or creating recreational facilities, giving the sort of offer that's available at places like the Royal Infirmary. And eventually, in the 20th century, they take advantage of the fact that characteristically they have much more land to offer better sports facilities. This is the nurses' hockey team from the Southern General Hospital. The photograph was taken in the 1930s. And you can see there that the nurses have the opportunity to compete. So, you know, if there is a young woman who, as well as wanting to nurse, also is enthusiastic about hockey, then going to the Southern gives her the chance to be part of a team which she can't do by coming to the Royal or the Western. The chap on the left of that photograph looks rather sinister to me. Right. The Great War, the First World War, has a huge impact in all sorts of ways, and nursing, of course, is impacted along with so much else. The scale of the casualties is absolutely colossal. 850,000, mostly young men who die. Many of them don't die immediately. They don't just drop dead on the battlefield. Many of them are nursed and then die. And a vast number who are wounded. Now, you know, wounded can mean all sorts of things from extremely serious to relatively moderate. But the scale of the challenge is massive, and this requires a huge infrastructure of casualty clearing stations pretty close to the front lines, and then large temporary field hospitals a bit further back. And there is also, of course, temporary hospitals in Britain to which patients can be sent using hospital trains. So, you know, a man who's seriously wounded will be stabilised in the casualty clearing station, treated at the temporary field hospital, and then put onto a hospital train possibly and sent back to Britain for further treatment. And all of this, of course, has the consequence that there is massive opportunities for capable young women to be promoted early in their careers to responsible jobs. Of course, the nurses don't actually go onto the field of battle. There are stretcher bearers who are serving in the army but do not carry firearms, who go out over the top and into no man's land and will carry out emergency first aid on the field of battle. And then, if their medical officer is in the trench, they will try and carry the casualty back to the trench. A lot of the medical officers don't stay in the trenches. They go over the top and carry out their work in the field of battle with bullets whizzing around them. And you can usually tell the men who did this, because it's pretty standard for medical officers who are willing to risk their lives in that way to be awarded the Military Cross. This is Stobs Hill Hospital. It's the architect's drawing conceptualizing the building as it was to be built, and the finished building is actually very similar to what you see on the slide. The reason I've put this here is that you can very easily make out the railway siding that comes right into the heart of the hospital. This was put in 1904, and in 1914-15 the hospital was handed over in its entirety. All the poor law activities ceased, and the hospital was handed over to the Royal Army Medical Corps as a temporary hospital for casualties coming in by train. I've spoken a lot in generalities up to this point, so I thought I'd perhaps just divert for a few moments and talk about a specific named individual. This woman trained at the Royal Infirmary. Helen Hamilton, born, as far as I can work out, in the late 1880s. One of many GRI trained nurses who went on to become the matron of a large field hospital in France. She began her nursing career at the Anglican Church Mildmay Mission Hospital, which is in the very worst of the slums in the East End of London. She comes to Glasgow at the age of 21 and enrolls as a probationer. Glasgow Royal Infirmary is one of the largest hospitals in Britain and has one of the most highly regarded nurse training schools, and it does attract people in this way from quite a distance. So she comes in 1909, completes her training in 1911, moves across to the Glasgow Ophthalmic Institution, which is the eye department of the Royal Infirmary, for a short time, gets a job as a matron in a small hospital in London, and then in 1915 moves to France to become the matron of a very large field hospital there. She marries the commanding officer of the field hospital, Colonel Walter Elliot, who some people in a previous generation would have remembered as a politician, and is a climber, a rock climber. Reminder of just how adventurous some of these women were. After the war, state registration for nurses is introduced, and this is very explicitly a recognition from the nation for the contribution of nurses to the war effort, and particularly, of course, helping to save the lives and to rehabilitate so many badly injured young men. There is a curious aspect to this which I think would make a very good PhD thesis for somebody, which is the politics of the legislation and how it comes to be that the men who have gone onto the field of battle to provide immediate first aid to the wounded are excluded from the state register. There are a lot of men with highly relevant experience, and yet the best they can hope for in peacetime is working in the ambulance service. Missionary work I've introduced here, as we're now sort of chronologically into the interwar years, because that's the point at which it becomes a significant factor for nurses at the Royal Infirmary. Prior to the First World War, young women who wanted to train as nurses with a view to working in the mission field overseas went to a separate institution which seems to have stopped functioning at some point during the First World War. And so after 1918, quite a lot of women with that kind of ambition come to the Royal Infirmary. I've put on the slide the Latin motto of the Lady Missionaries Training Home, because I think that carries forward the theme of moral uplift and Christian ethics. There we have the nursing lecture notebooks, or one of the notebooks, of a specific individual. This woman, Annie Watson, received a proposal of marriage when she was 18. Her would-be husband wanted her to come with him overseas. He was a qualified minister of religion. He was going overseas to do mission work. Her father intervened and said, no, she shouldn't go because she would be quite useless. She didn't know anything that would be of any help to anybody. So her father insisted that they had to wait 2 years before they married. She went and trained as a nurse at her father's expense. And then when she'd qualified, her future husband returned. They were married, and then off they went. And she never came back. She died overseas at the age of 55, having never returned to Glasgow. Here we have a woman who's qualified at the Royal Infirmary, writing from a mission hospital in India and referring to the exclusion from the company of Muslim women of all men. I mean, this is absolutely vital in relation to doctors, because, of course, one of the reasons why women are admitted to train as doctors is precisely to provide medical missionaries who can get access to Muslim women patients. I think I'm right in saying that about 50% of all the women who qualify in medicine in Glasgow before 1914 do, in fact, go overseas to work in the missions. Okay, let me just move on quickly to the interwar years. There is, of course, a bit of a boom in the 1920s, and that's then followed by the Wall Street crash, which leads to mass unemployment. And in Glasgow, that's particularly extreme because, of course, the shipbuilding, marine engineering, crane making, locomotive building industries, the heavy industries, are very, very hard hit by a big reduction in investment in capital goods. So the number of people entitled to poor relief is huge, and it's physically impossible for them all to be admitted to the poorhouse. Sir Alexander MacGregor, who is the medical officer of health for the city of Glasgow, sets up a tremendous domiciliary care system. So he puts both nurses and doctors on the payroll of Glasgow Corporation. And in the years from 1931 to about 1935-36, their main job is to look after the unemployed men and their families. But as rearmament gets underway, as marine shipping begins to generate a demand for luxury liners and so on, from about 1935-6 onwards, the number of patients of working age, the number of child patients falls off, and the service which MacGregor has set up becomes more heavily accented towards geriatric care. And arguably, this creates what is probably the best domiciliary geriatric care system in the world. The nurses of Glasgow going out into the community, caring for elderly people, are providing a tremendous service. Unfortunately, the whole thing has to be scrapped when the National Health Service is created. It doesn't fit with the NHS model, so it has to be done away with. During the Second World War, there are all sorts of developments which I don't really have time to go into here. But one which is not very often recognised, and I think is really significant, is the decision made in wartime to reduce nurses' working hours. Now, in theory, the Minister of Labour has almost despotic power over the civilian population. Not only can young men be conscripted to serve in the armed forces, but they can also be made to go and work in the coal mines or the steel works or whatever. And young women are also liable to direction of labour, effectively to conscription. So in theory, the government can simply say the nurses are in a protected occupation, they stay where they are, they go on working on their current terms and conditions. But they are the powers that be are sufficiently sensitive and sensible to realise that at a time when women are getting jobs in factories, working a 40-hour week and earning more money than the nurses do for a 60-hour week, that is not really a viable situation. So they reduce the standard working week for all nurses across the whole of Britain from 60 hours to 48. And that has a significant impact for the Royal Infirmary because it means that the infirmary has to increase its nursing workforce by 20%. And those people cannot be accommodated in the nurse's home. There just is not enough room in the nurse's home. So a large part of the nursing workforce from the Royal Infirmary move out to live with landladies, usually fairly close to the infirmary, but not always. And that marks a significant change, a move away from the primacy of the nurse's home. The change also has profound and very negative impact on institutional care for those with psychiatric illnesses and with severe learning difficulties. This is the interior of a ward at Lennox Castle, which was an institution for people with severe learning difficulties, and the unkind terminology of the time, those who were regarded as mentally deficient. Now, you'll see the ward is pretty Spartan. It accommodates 30 people. They're basically 30 beds in a room. Up to 1939, 1940, there was one nurse on duty in each ward at Lennox Castle every night. After the change in nurses' hours, that simply ceased to be feasible. The place is right out in the sticks at the back of nowhere. There wasn't enough accommodation and there weren't enough suitable people to recruit, so they were desperately short of people. And they ended up with one nurse being in charge of 2 wards, and these are 2 physically separate buildings. So you can see that that would have an impact on the quality of care, and it does. After the war, recruiting a sufficient number of nurses of a sufficiently high caliber becomes a problem. It's perceived by those who are in charge of nurse training as being a great challenge. They're struggling to recruit, and they're also struggling to retain. An awful lot of young women start nurse training but do not carry on with it. And this is partly because there are all sorts of opportunities now for young women. There's greater access to higher education, greater access to technical education. There are more jobs that are regarded as being suitable for women. And the economy of the United Kingdom is booming. In the post-war years, although there's all sorts of damage and there's a terrible housing crisis, Britain can export. The productive industries of Germany, France, Italy, Japan have all been destroyed. So there's huge demand for British products. The British economy booms. And against this background, possibly there is a change in outlook and attitude. This is the sort of thing that's very difficult to provide evidence for, but I think, there's at least an interesting question to think about there. And at the Royal Infirmary, there is a response to the changing times, to the new challenges, which is significant well beyond Glasgow. This starts with a report published in 1953 on the subject of nurse training and nurse recruitment, and leads to the creation of an experimental scheme of training which begins at the Royal Infirmary in 1957. And the scheme is essentially one of 2 years of classroom work and of structured observation, and it is observation, not participation, followed by 1 year of working on a ward as a reasonably competent staff nurse before sitting the final examinations for state registration. And the objectives, of course, are primarily about addressing the perceived problems. I was interested to see that improving patient care is actually quite low down on the list of objectives. So here we have a report from the Nursing Times, which simply says, this is happening and we will watch with great interest to see how it pans out. And here we have the report. The assessment committee on the scheme was chaired by Sir John Brotherston, who was the Chief Medical Officer of Scotland. Here they list the objectives which the scheme was set up to address, and they go on to say that as far as they're concerned, it's a success. It is, in fact, an indicator of where the future should lie. But the scheme was controversial at the time. A great many of the nurses who had qualified under the previous schemes regarded it both as divisive and elitist. But I think it is nonetheless identifiably the first step on the road that leads to the creation of graduate education for nurses. I have no profound conclusions to offer, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.